June 4, 1942, 320 miles northwest of Midway Atoll, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida lay on a stretcher in Akagi's sick bay, his abdomen still tender from an emergency appendectomy performed just hours before the battle began. Through the bulkheads, he could hear the muffled sounds of the carrier's crew preparing for combat operations. As the man who had led the Pearl Harbor attack 6 months earlier, Fuchida understood carrier operations better than almost anyone in the Imperial Japanese Navy. Yet even he could not have imagined the catastrophe about to unfold. The Japanese carrier striking force had approached Midway with absolute confidence. Vice Admiral Nagumo commanded 4 fleet carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, with a total of 248 aircraft. This was the most powerful naval aviation force ever assembled. These same carriers and many of these same pilots had struck Pearl Harbor, devastated the British Eastern Fleet in the Indian Ocean, and dominated every engagement in the Pacific War's first 6 months. Japanese naval aviators were the finest in the world, products of rigorous training programs that typically required over-sense flight hours before a pilot was considered combat-ready. The American defenders at Midway possessed a hodgepodge of obsolete aircraft and inexperienced pilots. Marine Corps Squadron flying ancient Vaude Buffalo fighters and SBD Dauntless dive bombers faced Japanese Zeros that outperformed them in every measurable category. Navy patrol squadrons operated lumbering PBY Catalina flying boats. The atoll's defences appeared pitifully inadequate against Nagumo's veteran carrier force. What Japanese intelligence had catastrophically failed to detect was the presence of 3 American aircraft carriers northeast of Midway. USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and USS Yorktown had positioned themselves based on intelligence breakthroughs that had revealed Japan's attack plans in stunning detail. American cryptanalysts had cracked the Japanese naval code JN-25, providing Admiral Chester Nimitz with precise information about Japanese objectives, timing, and force composition. The American carriers represented a desperate concentration of American naval power in the Pacific. Yorktown had been damaged at the Battle of Coral Sea just 1 month earlier and should have required 3 months of repairs. Pearl Harbor's shipyard workers accomplished the essential repairs in 72 hours, getting the carrier back to sea in time for Midway. Enterprise and Hornet were the only other American carriers available in the Pacific after the losses at Coral Sea. At 4:30 du matin on June 4, Nagumo launched the first strike against Midway 36 Aichi 3 Aval dive bombers, 36 Nakajima Bishanken Kate torpedo bombers configured as level bombers, and 36 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters. The Cent-Witt aircraft departed their carriers and headed toward Midway, 240 miles distant. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga led the strike force. His orders were to neutralize Midway's airfields and defense in preparation for the invasion force scheduled to land on June 7. Nagumo retained a second strike wave of Cent-Witt aircraft on his carriers Trent 6, dive bombers, and Trent 6 torpedo bombers, armed with ship-killing munitions, plus Trent 6 fighters. These aircraft were held in reserve to attack any American naval forces that might appear. Japanese doctrine emphasized flexibility. Carriers kept strike aircraft armed and ready to launch on short notice, allowing commanders to respond rapidly to changing tactical situations. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first American attack came not from carriers, but from Midway itself. At 6 du matin, 6 Navy TBF Avenger torpedo bombers from Midway attacked the Japanese carriers. The Avengers were brand new aircraft, so new that their crews had minimal training time. They pressed their attacks, with courage but no coordination. Japanese Zero fighters and anti-aircraft fire destroyed 5 of the 6 Avengers. The sole survivor returned to Midway so shot up that it never flew again. 4 Army Bevinged 6 Marauder Bombay, modified to carry torpedoes, attacked at 7 du matin. The Marauders had even less training with torpedoes than the Avenger crews. 2 were shot down. The remaining 2 scored no hits. Marine Corps SBD Dauntless dive bombers attacked at 7:55 du matin. The obsolete aircraft approached without fighter escort through storms of Zero fighters and anti-aircraft fire. They scored no hits and lost 8 of 16 aircraft. These attacks accomplished nothing except to reinforce Japanese confidence. American aircraft were sacrificing themselves in uncoordinated, ineffective attacks that posed no real threat to Nagumo's carriers. Every attack had been intercepted well away from the carriers. Not one bomb or torpedo had struck a Japanese ship. The afternoon would likely bring more of the same brave but futile American attacks that Japanese defenses would annihilate. At 7 du matin, Lieutenant Tomonaga radioed from the Midway strike force. There is need for a second attack. Midway's runways were damaged, but still operational. American aircraft were still taking off. Hangars and fuel storage facilities were burning, but Midway remained a functioning base. Tomonaga's assessment presented Nagumo with a critical decision. The Centuit aircraft held in reserve were armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs weapons for attacking ships. If Nagumo committed them to a second strike on Midway, he would need to bring them below to the hangars, remove the ship attack weapons, and replace them with land attack bombs and general-purpose ordnance. This process would take at least 90 minutes and leave the carriers vulnerable during the rearming process. At 7:15 du matin, Nagumo made his decision. He ordered the reserve strike force rearmed for a second attack on Midway. Ordnance crews began the laborious process of bringing aircraft below to the hangars, removing torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, and replacing them with land attack munitions. The removed torpedoes and bombs were not returned to the magazines as doctrine required. Instead, to save time, ordnance crews simply laid them on the hangar decks near the aircraft. This violation of safety protocols would prove catastrophic. At 7:28 du matin, exactly 13 minutes after Nagumo ordered the rearming operation, the cruiser, Tone's No. 4 reconnaissance float plane launched 20 minutes late due to catapult problems, transmitted the message that changed everything. Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships, bearing 010 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway. Course 150 degrees, speed over 20 knots. American surface ships, the message electrified Nagumo's staff. Were these merely cruisers and destroyers, or did the force include carriers? The reconnaissance report didn't specify. Nagumo immediately transmitted ascertain ship types and maintain contact. The Tone floatplane's pilot, struggling to observe through broken clouds, took another 20 minutes before sending. Enemy is composed of 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. No carriers. Nagumo and his staff relaxed slightly. Cruisers and destroyers posed minimal threat to a carrier task force with air superiority. The rearming operation for the Midway strike continued. But at 8:09 du matin, another message arrived from the Tone floatplane. The enemy is accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. American carriers were dangerous, but 1 carrier against 4 gave the Japanese overwhelming superiority. Still, Nagumo now faced a dilemma. He had Centuit aircraft being rearmed for a Midway strike. He had Centuit aircraft returning from the first Midway strike that would need to land immediately to refuel and rearm. He had 1 American carrier that needed to be attacked before it could launch strikes against his force. The obvious solution was to launch the reserve aircraft immediately against the American carrier, even though they were halfway through being rearmed and lacked fighter escort, since most fighters were aloft defending the carriers. But Nagumo rejected this option. He would not launch a poorly organized strike against an American carrier. Japanese doctrine emphasized coordinated attacks with dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and escort fighters striking simultaneously from multiple directions. At 8:30 du matin, the first Midway strike force began arriving back over the carriers. These aircraft were low on fuel, many were damaged, and they needed to land immediately. Nagumo made his final critical decision. He would recover the Midway strike force first, complete the rearming operation, then launch a properly organized attack against the American carrier with his full strength. This decision sealed the fate of the Japanese carrier force. For the next hour, Nagumo's carriers were at their most vulnerable recovering aircraft, refueling and rearming them on hangar decks, crowded with ordnance, unable to launch strikes, unable to maneuver aggressively while conducting flight operations. All 4 carriers were committed to the same operation simultaneously, concentrating vulnerability rather than dispersing it. What Nagumo didn't know was that American carrier aircraft were already in the air and heading toward his force. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Task Force C's with Enterprise and Hornet, had launched strikes beginning at 7 du matin long before the Japanese discovered the American carriers. Spruance had committed everything. Enterprise launched 33 SBD Dauntless dive bombers, 14 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, and DF-4F Wildcat fighters. Hornet launched 35 dive bombers, 15 torpedo bombers, and D fighters. Yorktown, under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher's tactical command, launched her strike at 8:30 du matin 17 dive bombers, 12 torpedo bombers, and 6 fighters. In total, 155 American aircraft were heading toward Nagumo's carriers. The American strikes were poorly coordinated. Different squadrons became separated. Navigation errors sent some groups in wrong directions. Fighter escorts failed to rendezvous with the bombers they were supposed to protect. The American attack would arrive as a series of uncoordinated strikes rather than a single overwhelming blow. But the Americans had one critical advantage. They had launched first. While Nagumo was still recovering and rearming his aircraft, American torpedo bombers were already approaching. At 9:30 du matin, lookouts on the Japanese carriers spotted the first American attack 15 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers from Hornet's torpedo squadron WIT. Not a single 4F Wildcat fighter escorted them. They had become separated from their escorts and pressed on alone. The Devastators approached at wave-top height, struggling to reach attack position at their painfully slow 15 knot top speed. Japanese Zeros swarmed them. The obsolete American torpedo bombers had no chance. Anti-aircraft fire from the carriers and screening ships filled the air. Zeros attacked from above and behind, the Devastator's most vulnerable angles. One by one, the American aircraft fell into the ocean. Ensign George Gay, flying as wingman to Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, watched his squadron die. Waldron's aircraft exploded first. Gay's gunner was killed. His plane was hit repeatedly but somehow stayed airborne long enough to release his torpedo at the carrier Soryu. The torpedo missed. Seconds later, Gay's Devastator crashed into the ocean. He was the only survivor from Torpedo Squadron WIT. 14 aircraft and 29 men were lost in less than 6 minutes. At 10 du matin, Enterprise's Torpedo Squadron 6 attacked with 14 Devastators. The slaughter repeated. Japanese Zeros and anti-aircraft fire destroyed 10 of the 14 aircraft. Not one torpedo hit. At 10 du matin, Yorktown's Torpedo Squadron 3 attacked, with 12 Devastators. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol had been drawn down to low altitude, chasing torpedo bombers. 10 of Yorktown's 12 torpedo bombers were shot down. Still not one torpedo hit. In 40 minutes, the Americans had lost 35 torpedo bombers and their crews. The Japanese had suffered no damage. Every officer on Nagumo's staff must have felt vindicated. American attacks were brave but hopeless. Obsolete aircraft flown by inadequately trained pilots could not penetrate Japanese defense. The afternoon would bring total victory, but the sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons had created the conditions for Japanese defeat. Every Japanese Zero fighter was at low altitude, attacking torpedo bombers. The Combat Air Patrol was completely out of position. The sky above the Japanese carriers was empty, and diving toward those carriers from Vingt, 000 feet were American dive bombers that no one had detected. 10:22 du matin, June 4, 1942. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's dive bomber group, finally spotted the Japanese carrier force after an extended search that had consumed precious fuel. McCluskey had launched at 7 du matin with 23 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise, plus 17 from Yorktown that had joined his formation. He had flown to the expected intercept point and found empty ocean. Japanese carriers had changed course. Rather than return to Enterprise with full bomb loads, McCluskey made a calculated decision. He would expand his search. For Trent-Cinque agonizing minutes, McCluskey's dive bombers searched the empty Pacific. Fuel gauge dropped toward minimums. Some pilots would not have enough fuel to return to Enterprise. Then, at 10 du matin, McCluskey spotted a lone Japanese destroyer racing northward at flank speed. The destroyer Arashi had been left behind to depth charge the American submarine USS Nautilus, which had attempted to attack the Japanese carriers. Now Arashi was racing to rejoin the carrier force, leaving a perfect white wake pointing directly toward Nagumo's carriers. McCluskey followed the wake. At 10:22 du matin, the Japanese carriers appeared for perfect targets spread across the ocean, recovering aircraft, crowded hangar decks visible through open elevator wells, completely vulnerable. McCluskey had found them at the exact moment when Japanese defense were at their weakest. The combat air patrol was at sea level chasing torpedo bombers. Anti-aircraft gunners were focused on low-altitude threats. No one was looking up. McCluskey's dive bombers were at Vingt 000 feet, perfectly positioned for attack. He assessed the targets quickly. 2 carriers were close together in the northern part of the formation Akagi and Kaga. A third carrier, Soryu, was slightly south. The fourth carrier, Hiryu, was several miles away. McCluskey divided his force. He would take Enterprise's Trent Tra dive bombers against Kaga. He ordered Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, leading the 2nd Division, to attack Akagi. At exactly the same moment, completely by coincidence, Yorktown's dive bomber group arrived over the Japanese formation from a different direction. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, leading 17 SBD Dauntless dive bombers, had followed a more direct course and arrived simultaneously with McCluskey's group. Leslie assessed the targets and selected Soryu for attack. 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers were about to be attacked simultaneously by 50 American dive bombers. None of the Japanese ships had detected the threat. The Americans had achieved complete tactical surprise at the single most critical moment of the battle. At 10:22 du matin, McCluskey transmitted one word: attack. 33 dive bombers rolled into their attack dives, screaming down toward Kaga from Vingt 000 feet at speeds exceeding 250 knots. The SBD Dauntless was an excellent dive bomber, stable, accurate, equipped with perforated dive brakes that allowed precise control during the near-vertical attack run. Each aircraft carried either a UN 000 pound armor-piercing bomb or a 6 pound general-purpose bomb. Kaga's crew had no warning. The first they knew of the attack was when lookouts spotted the dive bombers already plunging toward the ship. Air raid alarms screamed. Anti-aircraft guns began firing, but the gunners had no time to establish proper aim. Captain Jisaku Okada ordered emergency evasion maneuver, but the massive carrier needed time and space to turn. There was neither. The first bomb struck Kaga's flight deck near the bridge at 10:24 du matin. The UN 000 pound armor-piercing bomb penetrated the wooden flight deck and detonated in the upper hangar. The explosion ignited aviation fuel from aircraft being refueled. Secondary explosions ripped through the hangar as fuel tanks ruptured. A second bomb hit near the stern, penetrating to the lower hangar where fully armed aircraft awaited launch. Bombs and torpedoes that had been hastily removed from aircraft during the rearming operation were still lying loose on the hangar deck. These munitions began exploding in chain reactions. A third bomb struck Kaga amidships, detonating among the massed aircraft on the flight deck. A fourth bomb hit near the island superstructure, destroying the bridge and killing Captain Okada and most of his staff. In less than 3 minutes, Kaga had been transformed from a powerful warship into a blazing wreck. Uncontrollable fires consumed the ship. Ammunition explosions continued for hours. The carrier would burn throughout the afternoon before sinking that evening. Simultaneously, Earl Gallagher's dive bombers attacked Akagi. The flagship of the carrier striking force, Akagi had been Nagumo's command ship since Pearl Harbor. She was slightly smaller than Kaga, displacing 36 500 but carried a similar air group and possessed combat veteran crews. None of that mattered against dive bombers attacking from directly overhead. The first bomb narrowly missed, exploding in the water alongside Akagi's hull. The second bomb struck the edge of the midships elevator, which was in the lowered position. The 0.000-pound bomb plunged through the open elevator shaft directly into the hangar deck. The detonation occurred among fully armed and fueled aircraft. The explosion was catastrophic. Aviation fuel ignited. Ordnance cooked off. The prepared strike force Trent 6 aircraft armed with torpedoes and bombs became Trent 6 sources of secondary explosions. A third bomb hit near the port stern, rupturing fuel lines and starting fires in the aft part of the ship. Akagi's damage control parties attempted to fight the fires, but the blazes were already beyond control. Explosion continued as ammunition, bombs and torpedoes detonated. The fire suppression systems were overwhelmed. Within 20 minutes of the first bomb hit, fires raged throughout Akagi's hangar deck and were spreading to the flight deck. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. At virtually the same instant, Maxwell Leslie's Yorktown dive bombers attacked Soryu. The third Japanese carrier suffered the same catastrophic vulnerability. Armed and fueled aircraft crowded together, volatile ordnance scattered across hangar decks, fuel lines pressurized for rapid refueling operations. 3 bombs struck Soryu in rapid succession. All 3 penetrated to the hangars. All 3 detonated among the massed aircraft. Captain Ryuzaku Yanagimoto, commanding Soryu, immediately recognized that his ship was doomed. Fires spread faster than damage control teams could contain them. Explosions racked the hangar decks continuously. The wooden flight deck was burning. Within 6 minutes of the first bomb hit, Yanagimoto ordered all non-essential personnel to abandon ship. He remained on the bridge, refusing to leave his command. From first bomb hit to fatal damage on all 3 carriers, 5 minutes. At 10:22 du matin, Nagumo commanded 4 fleet carriers, 248 aircraft, and the most powerful naval aviation force in the world. At 10:27 du matin, 3 of his 4 carriers were blazing wrecks with only hours to live. The American dive bombers had achieved the most devastating 5-minute period in naval aviation history. The tactical situation transformed utterly. Minutes earlier, Japan had dominated the battle. Now, 3 Japanese carriers were dying, their aircraft and crews lost, their capability to project power eliminated. The Americans still had 3 operational carriers with most of their aircraft intact. The balance of power in the Central Pacific had reversed in 3 seconds. Vice Admiral Nagumo stood on Akagi's bridge as flames spread through his flagship. Staff officers reported fires out of control, magazines flooding to prevent catastrophic explosions, steering damaged, propulsion uncertain. The admiral who had struck Pearl Harbor, who had terrorized the Indian Ocean, who had never tasted defeat, watched his command disintegrate. At 10:46 du matin, 2 minutes after the first bomb hit, Nagumo transferred his flag to the cruiser Nagara. Akagi was abandoned to her fate. The admiral stood on Nagara's bridge and watched 3 carriers, his entire strike force, except for Hiryu, burning across the horizon. Black smoke rose thousands of feet into the clear morning air. The pillars of smoke were visible for 50 miles in every direction, marking the funeral pyres of Japanese naval aviation. But the battle was not over. Hiryu, the 4th carrier, had been several miles north of the other 3 carriers when the dive bombers struck. She had escaped the attack that destroyed her sisters. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, commanding Hiryu, was one of the Imperial Japanese Navy's most aggressive officers. He had opposed the cautious approach to Midway operations. Now he found himself commanding the only operational Japanese carrier in the battle. Yamaguchi immediately began preparing counterstrikes. Hiryu had 18 Aichi D3 aval, dive bombers and 10 Nakajima Bishinken Kate torpedo bombes still operational. He would launch everything in 2 waves. The first strike Dixui dive bombers escorted by 60 fighters launched at 10:40 du matin, just 13 minutes after the American attack ended. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led the strike toward the last reported position of American carriers. The American carriers had problems of their own. McCluskey's dive bombers were critically low on fuel after their extended search. Many aircraft were running on fumes, several ditched in the ocean when their engines quit. Others landed on Enterprise and Yorktown, with fuel gauge reading empty. The strike had been extraordinarily successful, but fuel management was becoming critical. At 12 de l'après-midi, radar operators on Yorktown detected Hiryu's incoming strike 24 aircraft approaching from the northwest. F-4F Wildcat fighters scrambled to intercept. The combat air patrol engaged the Japanese formation 20 miles from the carriers. American fighters shot down 10 of the 18 dive bombers before they reached attack range. The remaining 8 Val dive bombers pressed through to attack Yorktown. 3 bombs struck Yorktown between 12:10 and 12:12 de l'après-midi. 1 bomb penetrated the flight deck and detonated in the lower decks, starting fires. A second bomb hit near the island, killing and wounding dozens of men. A third bomb struck the flight deck, rupturing fire mains. The carrier was damaged but remained operational. Damage control parties extinguished fires. By 1:40 de l'après-midi, Yorktown had restored enough capability to begin landing aircraft. But Yamaguchi wasn't finished. At 1:30 de l'après-midi, Hiryu launched her second strike 10 torpedo bombes escorted by 60 fighters. The strike headed toward Yorktown's last known position. At 2:40 de l'après-midi, lookouts on Yorktown spotted the incoming torpedo bombers. The carrier increased speed to 20 knots and began violent evasive maneuvers. F-4F Wildcats from the Combat Air Patrol intercepted the Japanese formation. American fighters shot down 5 of the Dix torpedo bombers. The remaining 5 pressed their attacks with suicidal determination. They approached Yorktown from multiple directions, forcing the carrier into impossible tactical choices. Evading torpedoes from one direction meant presenting a better target to aircraft attacking from another direction. At 2:43 de l'après-midi, 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown on the port side. The underwater explosions ruptured the hull and flooded machinery spaces. The carrier lost all propulsion and began listing severely. Captain Elliot Buckmaster ordered abandon ship at 3 de l'après-midi. Destroyers moved alongside to take off Yorktown's crew. The carrier appeared doomed dead in the water, listing 26 degrees, fires burning in multiple locations. But Yorktown was tough. She remained afloat throughout the afternoon, her structural integrity holding, despite massive damage. 2 days later, a salvage party would reboard the carrier and begin efforts to tow her to Pearl Harbor. Those efforts would end when the Japanese submarine Issant 68 torpedoed Yorktown on June 6, finally sinking the carrier that had survived so much punishment. The damage to Yorktown seemed like a Japanese victory. Yamaguchi had struck back effectively. But tactically, trading Yorktown for 3 Japanese carriers was a catastrophic exchange ratio, and Hiryu's counterstrikes had revealed her position to American search aircraft. Enterprise and Hornet still possessed substantial strike capability. At 3:30 de l'après-midi, Enterprise launched 24 dive bombers to attack Hiryu. The American dive bombers found Hiryu at 5 de l'après-midi. 4,1,000 bombs struck the carrier in rapid succession. All 4 penetrated to the hangar decks. The same catastrophic pattern repeated, fires spreading among armed and fueled aircraft, secondary explosions, damage control efforts overwhelmed by the intensity of the blazes. Within an hour, Hiryu was a blazing wreck. Yamaguchi refused to abandon his flagship. He would go down with Hiryu when she finally sunk early the next morning. By nightfall on June 4, all 4 Japanese carriers were destroyed or dying. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu would sink during the night. Hiryu would follow at dawn. Japan had lost 248 aircraft and approximately 3,000 men, including hundreds of irreplaceable veteran pilots and aircrew. The most powerful carrier striking force ever assembled had been annihilated in one day. American loss was severe but sustainable: 1 carrier, 145 aircraft, 307 men. Enterprise and Hornet remained operational with enough aircraft to continue offensive operations. The strategic balance in the Pacific had shifted irreversibly. Japan would never regain the initiative. The Battle of Midway entered American consciousness as the decisive turning point of the Pacific War, the moment when American forces stopped Japan's expansion and began the long counter-offensive that would end at Tokyo Bay. Every aspect of the battle has been analyzed, debated, and mythologized. 1 particular myth has proven remarkably persistent: that Essex-class carriers launched 90 aircraft in 8 minutes at Midway, overwhelming Japanese defense with impossible speed and volume. This claim appears frequently in popular histories, documentaries, and online discussions. It seems to explain how American forces achieved such devastating success. If carriers could launch aircraft that rapidly, the Japanese never had a chance. The myth combines several appealing elements: American technological superiority, industrial efficiency, and the decisive impact of the Essex-class carriers that would dominate the latter years of the Pacific War. There's only one problem with this compelling narrative: it's completely false. No Essex-class carrier participated in the Battle of Midway because no Essex-class carrier had been completed by June 1942. The lead ship of the class, USS Essex herself, would not be commissioned until December 30, 1942, 7 months after Midway. Understanding why this myth exists, what actually happened at Midway, and what the Essex-class carriers actually achieved requires examining both the battle's reality and the carriers' genuine capabilities. The 3 American carriers at Midway were Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, all older designs, commissioned in the late 1930s. Enterprise and Yorktown were Yorktown-class carriers, displacing 25 500 tons fully loaded. Hornet was technically a modified Yorktown class, nearly identical in design. These carriers had single hangar designs with 2 elevators, limiting their aircraft handling capacity. Each carrier operated approximately 90 aircraft under wartime conditions. Flight operations on these carriers were methodical, careful, and relatively slow by later standards. Launching a full strike of 50 à 60 aircraft typically required 60 à 90 minutes. Aircraft had to be brought up from the hangar on elevators, spotted on the flight deck in launch sequence, engines started, warmed up, and launched, one at a time into the wind. The process could not be rushed without creating dangerous conditions on the crowded flight deck. At Midway, Enterprise launched her strike beginning at 7 du matin. The launch sequence took approximately 1 hour to get 57 aircraft airborne: 33 dive bombers, 14 torpedo bombers, and D fighters. This was typical performance for carriers of that era. Hornet launched 60 aircraft in a similar time frame. Yorktown, launching later at 8:30 du matin, got 35 aircraft aloft in roughly 45 minutes. These were competent, professional flight operations executed by experienced crews. They were not exceptionally fast compared to Japanese carrier operations. The Japanese carriers at Midway could launch and recover aircraft at similar rates. The critical difference was not launch speed, but rather timing and luck. American carriers launched their strikes early, before being detected. Japanese carriers were caught during recovery and rearming operations when they were most vulnerable. The American victory at Midway resulted from intelligence advantages, tactical decisions, and fortune, not from revolutionary carrier technology that didn't yet exist. The Essex-class carriers that would later dominate the Pacific were still on drawing boards or in early construction when Midway was fought. The class had been authorized in 1940 as part of American naval expansion programs preparing for possible war. The design incorporated lessons from earlier carriers, particularly regarding armor protection, damage control, and aviation handling efficiency. Essex-class carriers would displace 36, 600 tons fully loaded, carry 90 aircraft under wartime conditions, and incorporate vastly improved damage control systems. But in June 1942, these capabilities were theoretical. Essex was under construction at Newport News Shipbuilding. Her keel had been laid on April 28, 1941. Construction proceeded rapidly by peacetime standards, but would still require 20 months to completion. When Enterprise and Hornet fought at Midway, Essex was merely a partially assembled hull in a building way. Months from launch, nearly a year from commissioning, the first Essex-class carrier to see combat was Essex herself, entering the Pacific Theatre in May 1943, nearly a year after Midway. She participated in the Marcus Island raid on August 31, 1943, launching her first combat strikes. Essex's performance demonstrated the class's capabilities. She could operate 90 aircraft comfortably, significantly more than the older Yorktown-class carriers. Her improved hangar design and 3-elevator system allowed more efficient aircraft handling, but even Essex, with all her improvements, could not launch 90 aircraft in 8 minutes. A full-deck launch of 50 à 60 aircraft still required 45 à 60 minutes under combat conditions. Launching 90 aircraft would require multiple deck cycles, bringing aircraft up from the hangar, launching them, then bringing up additional aircraft for a second launch cycle. The entire process would consume 90 à 120 minutes. The myth of 8-minute launch times likely stems from confusion about what launch cycle means. Carriers could launch aircraft from a fully spotted deck aircraft already positioned, engines running, ready for immediate takeoff in much shorter time frames. The actual takeoff sequence, once aircraft were spotted and ready, could proceed rapidly. A carrier launching aircraft every 30 à 45 seconds from a full deck could get 12 à 15 aircraft airborne in 8 minutes. But this represented only the final stage of flight operations. The hours of preparation beforehand, bringing aircraft up from hangars, arming them, fueling them, conducting pre-flight checks, starting engines, warming them up, spotting them in proper sequence consumed far more time than the actual takeoffs. Describing only the takeoff sequence while ignoring all the preparation creates a misleading impression of overall operational tempo. Where Essex-class carriers truly revolutionized American naval aviation was in sustained operations. The older carriers could launch a major strike, but then required hours to recover, refuel, rearm, and prepare for another strike. Essex-class carriers, with their larger hangars, additional elevators, improved fueling systems, and more extensive magazines, could sustain a higher operational tempo over extended periods. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, Essex-class carriers demonstrated this sustained capability. Task Force 58 included 7 Essex-class carriers plus 8 light carriers. Over 2 days, these carriers launched continuous strikes against Japanese forces, maintaining combat air patrol, conducting anti-submarine patrols, and executing offensive strikes simultaneously. The Japanese carriers, smaller and less capable of sustained operations, could not match this tempo. The Marianas Turkey Shoot, on June 19, 1944, showed American carrier superiority at its peak. Japanese carrier aircraft attacked the American task force in 4 waves totaling approximately 363 aircraft. American fighters from the Essex-class carriers, directed by radar-equipped fighter directors, intercepted the Japanese formations before they reached the carriers. American pilots shot down approximately 300. Japanese aircraft in what pilots described as a turkey shoot, so one-sided, it resembled shooting game birds rather than combat. American loss, 29 aircraft. Japanese loss, 300 aircraft, and 3 carriers sunk. The Essex-class carriers operated throughout the engagement without damage, launching and recovering fighters continuously. This was the capability that won the Pacific War, not mythical 8-minute launch times, but the ability to sustain combat operations indefinitely while Japanese forces exhausted themselves in futile attacks. By war's end, the US Navy had commissioned Dixept Essex-class carriers. These ships formed the backbone of American naval aviation for decades. They participated in every major operation from late 1943 through the end of the war: the Gilbert Islands, the Marshalls, Truk, the Marianas, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and the final strikes on Japan. No Japanese carrier force could contest their dominance after 1943. The contrast between American and Japanese carrier construction during the war demonstrates industrial capacity differences. The United States commissioned Dixept Essex-class fleet carriers between 1942 and 1946, plus 9 Independence-class light carriers converted from cruiser hulls, plus over 100 escort carriers for anti-submarine and ground support roles. Japan commissioned 2 fleet carriers during the same period, Taiho and Shinano, both of which were sunk within months of entering service. This industrial imbalance, more than any tactical innovation, explains American dominance in the Pacific. Essex-class carriers were good designs, well-built and effective, but their true advantage was numbers. Japan could not possibly construct carriers fast enough to replace losses, while also building destroyers, submarines, cargo ships, and all the other vessels required for a maritime war. American shipyards built carriers faster than Japan could sink them. The myth of Essex-class carriers at Midway persists because it simplifies a complex narrative. The actual Battle of Midway resulted from intelligence, tactical decisions made under uncertainty, individual courage, and considerable luck. The American dive bombers arrived over the Japanese carriers at exactly the moment when Japanese defenses were most vulnerable, not because of superior launch speeds, but because torpedo bomber attacks had drawn Japanese fighters down to sea level. If the torpedo bombers had not attacked, or if they had attacked at different times, the dive bombers would have faced intact fighter defenses. If McCluskey had not spotted the destroyer Arashi racing northward, he might never have found the Japanese carriers. If Japanese reconnaissance aircraft had detected American carriers earlier, Nagumo might have launched his strike before American aircraft arrived. The battle balanced on dozens of small decisions and random events, but nuanced narratives of complex events don't satisfy the desire for clear explanations. It's more satisfying to attribute American victory to superior technology, Essex-class carriers launching aircraft at impossible speeds, overwhelming Japanese forces through mechanical superiority. This narrative feels right even though it's factually wrong. The Essex-class carriers did eventually prove superior to Japanese carriers in every measurable way: aircraft capacity, sustained operations, damage resistance, radar capabilities, and especially in the ability to replace losses. But they didn't fight at Midway because they didn't exist yet. The victory at Midway was won by older carriers, obsolete torpedo bombers, and dive bombers that would be replaced by better aircraft within a year. Japanese admirals who survived the war were certainly shocked by many aspects of American carrier operations they encountered in 1943 and 1945. Essex-class carriers operating in task groups of 4 or 5 carriers, with dozens of escorting ships, represented a concentration of power Japanese forces could not match. The sustained operations, the endless waves of aircraft, the ability to absorb losses and continue fighting, all of this shocked Japanese commanders who had planned on fighting brief, decisive engagements. But the shock wasn't about impossibly fast launch times. It was about industrial capacity translating into overwhelming operational capability. One Essex-class carrier might not be dramatically superior to one Japanese fleet carrier in a theoretical one-on-one engagement, but 4 Essex-class carriers, with full escorts, supported by fleet oilers for underway replenishment, operating with complete radar direction and fighter control, supported by intelligence services that read Japanese communications in real time, that combination was unbeatable. The Battle of Midway marked the end of Japanese offensive capability in the Pacific. The destruction of 4 fleet carriers and their experienced air groups created a deficit Japan never recovered from. But Midway was fought with pre-war carriers on both sides, implementing pre-war doctrines, flying early war aircraft. The revolutionary American advantages that would dominate 1943 à 1945 Essex-class carriers, Hellcat fighters, Avenger torpedo bombers, advanced radar, massive industrial production, were still months or years away from operational deployment. Understanding this timeline matters because it clarifies what actually won the war. American victory resulted from industrial capacity, strategic planning, intelligence capabilities, and tactical competence, not from mythical technologies. The Essex-class carriers were important, but they were symptoms of American industrial power rather than causes of it. Japan lost the Pacific War when it attacked a nation capable of building Dixsept fleet carriers in 3 years, while maintaining simultaneous offensive operations in Europe. Japanese admirals should have been shocked by that capability. But they had plenty of warning. American industrial capacity was never secret. Japanese planning for the Pacific War assumed victory would come through decisive battles fought before American industry fully mobilized. When Midway destroyed Japan's first-line carrier force, that strategy collapsed. What followed was exactly what Japanese planners feared: a prolonged war of industrial attrition that Japan could not win. The myth of Essex carriers at Midway obscures this reality. The battle was decided by intelligence, luck, and courage, not by supercarriers that didn't exist yet. The Essex-class carriers would come later, and they would dominate the Pacific. But at Midway, on June 4, 1942, American victory came from older ships and brave men executing a desperate plan that barely worked. That true story is more impressive than any myth.